And welcome to this edition of Hidden History Stories from the Secret City. I'm Keith McDaniel, along with my co host, Ray Smith. Good morning, Ray. How are you?
I'm good. How are you today?
I'm good. It's a stormy Saturday morning here in Oak Ridge, but I think
Yeah.
most of it's passed us by now. So hopefully, hopefully nothing will happen to knock us off here. Um, we got a very special guest with us today, Ray. Why don't you introduce him?
Sure, I'll be glad to. You talk about raining here in Oak Ridge. We've got our guest, Alan Carr, who's coming to us from Los Alamos, New Mexico. So we probably got a different weather situation there. Alan is the historian for the Los Alamos National Laboratory, and he and I have been friends for a number of years. He's actually visited Oak Ridge and made presentations to us here and invited me out there to make presentations there. So, Alan, we're glad to have you with us this morning. You can tell our audience anything else you'd like for them to know about you before we get started.
Well, Ray, it's great to see you again. And of course, I'm getting to meet Keith for the first time today. So nice to meet you as well, Keith, and to spend a little bit of the morning. And yes, the weather is a little bit different here. It is clear and sunny, and that is the weather in Los Alamos probably 75+% of the time. So it looks like it's going to be a pretty day.
It is, and I love to visit out there. Fanny and I come out. We used to come out more often than we have in the last few years, but we love to come out there. And every time we come, she comes back with some jewelry. She loves that turquoise jewelry out there. So
Yes, we do have
we
some.
enjoy
We
visiting.
have some incredible craftsmen here, and Ray, for sure, you and Keith both have an open invitation. It'd be great to host you here, and I don't mind inviting myself back to Oak Ridge. I would love to come back there once this COVID business clears up
Yeah,
just a little bit more.
yeah,
Alan,
we
go ahead,
we'd
Ray.
love to have you back. Go ahead, Keith.
Um, I wanted you to start out with how did you end up becoming the historian for Los Alamos for the National Lab?
There is a little bit of an interesting story there. Now, a story right after I got my job. Actually, after I got my clearance, they moved me into our building, which our old building used to be a vault type room, the whole building just about. And my office mate was the former head of the weapons program, John Hopkins, and John, still a very good friend of mine. He was a test director for a year, head of our field testing division, head of the weapons program. Always has tons of great stories. And he was writing a book on the history of atmospheric testing at the Nevada test site. And you can look that up. You can buy it on Amazon. It's by John Hopkins, Barbara Germain Killian. And he looked at me and he said, Alan, the odds of you winning the lottery are probably a lot better than the odds of you getting this job. And he was so right. There aren't a lot of jobs like this around. This is really beyond a dream job for me because I don't think that I could have come up with a better job being historian. So I barely graduated from high school. I was a reclamation project, kind of got my academic career turned around, ended up going to Texas Tech, and my graduate work is in the early Soviet Union, particularly the Soviet military. And so I spent a year looking for a job, put in jobs everywhere. This is in the post 9/11 economy, so there weren't that many great opportunities. Found this job, an advertisement for it, and my background, in the Soviet Union, what I'd studied in history, kind of matched up with it really nice. But I thought, there's no way I'll get a call back, and I got a call back,
Wow.
and that was from Roger Mead, who is Roger's my predecessor, and still up here working at the laboratory in retirement. He's a lifer, is what we call them. But anyway, it's I've been here for nearly 18 years now, and it's just a wonderful place to work. And John Hopkins was right. I beyond won the lottery when I ended up here, and I'll always be grateful for that.
Well, you do realize that I could have that same story with just a little different twist about how I got to be the historian at Y12. And I agree with you. There are no better jobs than yours and mine that we enjoyed. I had 10 years as a historian. And of course, it's funny, I continued to do presentations and and being the historian for the city, but also and closely tied to Y12. Fanny says, Ray, I can't tell any difference after you retired. You're still doing the same things you were doing when you were working. And I said, hon, I can tell the difference. I used to get paid for this.
Indeed.
But anyway, so you're still on the payroll, so you're getting paid to do what you love to do.
Go figure.
Yeah, that's an amazing opportunity. Well, why don't you start off by telling us a connection between how Los Alamos and Oak Ridge pair up, how they go together. You can start back at the Manhattan Project if you want to, or talk about today, however you'd like to do it. Just help our Oak Ridge audience understand how Los Alamos fits into the picture.
Right, right. Well, I'll start in ancient history because that's where I live anyway. I'm not even sure what goes on now, right? But the Manhattan Project, and I think we would all agree, Ray. You Keith, tell me if you get a different perception. But I do think Los Alamos gets a disproportionate amount of attention. And a lot of people don't realize that the Manhattan Project was a huge national endeavor. And really, when you consider how many contributions were made by foreign nationals and foreign born scientists, an international endeavor as well. And so I believe, for instance, to put this in perspective, the Manhattan Project employed like 500,000 people at one point or another during its existence. I think at the peak of the existence of the Manhattan Project, it simultaneously employed about 130,000 people. A good article by our friend Alex Wellerstein on his blog, by the way, for people who want to dig into those numbers and look at a really great article that's well cited. But anyway, the Manhattan Project had sites all over the country. All of these sites were important. And I don't say that, just to be nice or whatever. I mean, in the Manhattan Project, this is history's biggest, most secret project. If your job wasn't important, then you weren't involved. These were all important jobs. And probably the single most common job throughout the Manhattan Project was construction worker. Okay. Because there was no Oak Ridge, there was no Hanford, was no Los Alamos. These were places that had to be built very quickly. And when we come back to Oak Ridge in just a moment, we'll talk about that a little bit more. But those are just the three main sites. There are all these other sites as well. But let's focus on the three big sites really quickly. Of course, I think of it like this: you can have the world's best bomb design, but if you don't have any material for your nuclear weapon, then it's not going to be very effective, is it? And that works the other way around. You can have all the fissile material in the world, but if you don't know how to assemble it effectively into some kind of weapon, that's probably not going to help either. I guess you could just drop a block of stuff on somebody out of a plane. Probably not a very good weapon, though. And so you need all of these people to come together and make this a success. And so at Los Alamos, the job here, we were the weapons design laboratory of the Manhattan Project. And so our job was to design, build, test, and help figure out ways to deliver these new weapons in combat. So that's what we did here. And when you look at the numbers, the staff members, things like that, we're actually a really small piece of the Manhattan Project. I think at our peak, the technical staff reached about 1,700 people. So think about that. We look in 1945, the Manhattan Project is paying nearly 130,000 people. Only 1,700 of them comprise the technical staff here at Los Alamos. And so that's why, as I know I get paid to promote Los Alamos, but I want to promote kind of everybody else that made this possible. For those people out there who think that J. Robert Oppenheimer and Einstein kind of invented this thing and built it in his garage, that's not really the way that it went. And so, at Hanford, of course, we're going to make plutonium. And then we go back to Oak Ridge. Oak Ridge is where enriched uranium was made. I believe that also got to visit the X-10 reactor there, which was the first prototype reactor for making plutonium as well. That would be reproduced many times over at Hanford. But Oak Ridge had those capabilities. And what I like to point out again, to give some sense of scale for the Manhattan Project and the importance of all of these other people, is the K-25 gaseous diffusion plant, which I believe is just an open field now. But at one point, it was the largest building under one roof that had ever been constructed, and it was constructed fast. And that's just you think about that. That's just one building at one facility of the Manhattan Project, for one of the important jobs that needed to be done. And so again, I think that's how these places fit together. You need to be able to design and build a bomb. You also need fissile materials for a bomb. You need to figure out how to deliver it into combat, working with the Army Air Forces. And so it takes a little bit more than a village to make an atomic bomb, especially in the mid 40s.
It's
That is so right. And you mentioned 1,700 people at Los Alamos. Y-12 alone, there were 22,482 people working just at that one facility in Oak Ridge. And of course, 75,000 people living in Oak Ridge. So yes, the Manhattan Project had 3 primary locations, but several others, and we could name dozens of them actually that were doing something to contribute to the Manhattan Project. General Groves literally would reach to anyone that had something that was needed and use his leverage to cause those people to contribute, not knowing many times what they were doing, but to contribute to the needs. And I can't help but think of the insulators for the Calutrons. Coors Brewery in Colorado Bill Coors actually made those insulators, not having any idea what he was producing, but he produced what they specified. And then years later, only several years later, learned that he'd been actually producing those insulators for those Calutrons in Oak Ridge. So you're right. It was a huge undertaking. And that's why now when someone wants to do something really big, they'll call it a Manhattan Project type effort. So it's common to see that happen.
Alan, it's interesting. When you first started talking, you talked about the unproportionate amount of credit that Los Alamos gets in history. And that was one of the reasons that back in 2003, 2004, when I first started my first documentary about the history of Oak Ridge, is the story of Oak Ridge, other than in books, had never really been told widely. And that was one of the comments. They said, whenever the History Channel does something on the Manhattan Project, Oak Ridge might get a mention, but a lot of the focus is on Los Alamos. So I think between the work that Ray and I have done over the last 15 or 20 years, hopefully, and some other folks, we've been able to kind of share Oak Ridge's story and the important role that it had in the Manhattan Project in total. So,
absolutely.
Yeah, Alan, there's one story that I'll ask you to help me to make the connection between Oak Ridge and Los Alamos. Again, the Calutrons at Y-12 were being used with feed material from K-25 at near the end there in 45, and also from S-50, the thermal diffusion plant. But from the Y-12 plant, when they would finish the product, they'd get the uranium-235 out of the Calutrons. It's said that they would package that up in small coffee cup size gold lined containers, put 2 of them in a briefcase, strap it to an Army lieutenant's arm, dress him up to look like a salesman, and put him on a passenger train up through Chicago. And when they got to Chicago, they would actually switch off the people and take 2 other people. And that reminds me of something you'll be familiar with about General Groves. Compartmentalization. You mentioned that if you didn't need to know what you were doing during the Manhattan Project, you wouldn't be made aware of it. And that he kept everything compartmentalized. Now, Los Alamos was a little different. The scientists working together, as you know, had to talk to one another, but that was not the case here. Even one of the Calutron girls, when she came back in 2004, said, Ray, I never did know what I was doing. And that's the case. Most didn't. But these people that would transport this material up through Chicago and then on another train going out toward Los Alamos, can you pick up the story from when it got out there, how it got up to the lab?
Well, I can guess. And and
Okay.
I don't mind saying that. You know, I don't mind guessing.
Yeah.
So let me tell you about the way that that type of thing was typically done when we had new people that
Right.
would arrive out here. Because you're so right. I mean, it's interesting. Just the story of how things were transported during the Manhattan Project. That alone is a really interesting story. Of
Right.
course, I guess we used lots of briefcases. I believe that the pit of the gadget, for instance, was put in
Right.
a suitcase, put in the back of the car, and shipped from Los Alamos down to the Trinity site for Trinity for that test, and we may talk about that in a little while. But incoming material. Now, you know, when we were talking a little bit earlier, the job here was not only to design but also to build these things. Los Alamos was pit production until Rocky Flats came online in the early 1950s, and so that used to be mission space. It's kind of become mission space again here at Los Alamos, but people coming to Los Alamos would typically arrive by train, and actually that was one of the reasons why Los Alamos selected it. Was close to a rail hub, and so let's uh, let's be very generous in our definition of rail hub. Okay, so Ray, you've been here before to Los Alamos. You've been to Santa Fe, of course, done some jewelry shopping there, right? Well,
Yeah.
south of town, there's this little community called Lamy. And
Yes.
there is a train station. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the area, it's probably going to take about, 45, 50 minutes today to drive from Los Alamos to the Lamy train station. Now, back then, the roads weren't as good. It was wartime. Your car's probably going to break down. you know, so it's a little bit more of an outing, but we're going to count that as close enough as
Hmm.
a rail hub. And I should mention as well that the Lamy train station historically, don't think like Grand Central Station. We love our train station there, but think more of like a platform with a phone. So that's good. That's how we're going to start. Fortunately, that phone was there because you were going to need a ride. And I have wondered before if people arriving at the train station wondered, is this the right place? Did I get off? Surely this can't be right, because it is. I mean, it's kind of out there. It's not like in the middle of a town. Again, Santa Fe is not a huge town. This isn't even in Santa Fe. It's south of town. And so you get off the train there. You place a call on the telephone, and that call would go to 109 East Palace in Santa Fe. Now, 109 East Palace is in downtown Santa Fe. The building is still there. It's in use. I believe that it is a store these days, kind of a tourist shop type of thing. And anyway, back then it was the University of California's office. And some of you may be wondering, wait a minute, University of California? Ray was talking about the Coors Brewery and how they made their contribution to the war without knowing it. And remember, all these construction workers, so many other people, even at Los Alamos, it was pretty heavily compartmentalized here as
Mhm.
well. Not to the extent as some of the other places, but we were compartmentalized. Well, another organization that made a contribution without really fully knowing what it was they were getting into was the University of California. And so Oppenheimer originally, for instance, was going to be a lieutenant colonel in the Army. And he seemed to have no problem with that. He started trying to call up scientists at places like MIT and Chicago and saying, hey, instead of working on radar, what if you quit that? You can leave your family behind. You can go through basic training. You get a cool uniform and you can come work for me, Lieutenant Colonel Oppenheimer. What do you say? And of course, that was not very successful. And this was a pretty major annoyance to General Groves. I think probably to some extent to Oppenheimer as well. But anyway, Oppenheimer was an employee of both Caltech and the University of California at that point in time. Other universities were already involved, and in fact, parts of the UC were involved in this project already. But what they did, long story short, before we get back to transferring enriched
Mhm.
uranium around and things like that, um, the university is contacted, and they agree to kind of administer the work at Los Alamos, not really knowing what was going on here. Basically, the agreement was, hey, if you guys are doing something in the national interest during this time of war, you can slap our brand on it. That's fine. And so now Oppenheimer could call people up and say, hey, what would you think about joining the
Yeah.
faculty of the University of California? This was also good for secrecy because as we're talking about shipping stuff around the country, it looks kind of suspicious if the Army is shipping around calutrons and spectrographs and oscilloscopes and other pieces of scientific equipment. But if the university is sending those to other universities in the area, maybe that doesn't look as suspicious. So it was for security reasons as well. But anyway, they had an office in downtown Santa Fe at 109 East Palace. It was run by a woman named Dorothy McKibben. And so Dorothy, now I think there's at least one biography of her out
Yeah.
there. Look that one up as well. And
Mhm.
there's a book called 109 East Palace by Jeanette Conant, who I think that Ray knows. I met Jeanette many years ago, but a great read. Anyway, known as the gatekeeper of Los Alamos, she or somebody on the staff down there, they would send a car to come pick you up. And so we'll take our soldier in disguise from Oak Ridge with his briefcase. We're going to go pick him up, and again, we're just guessing here, right?
Yeah.
And come over to 109 East Palace. Now, depending on the business, let's say it's just like somebody who's going to be an employee, regular employee. They would take your photograph, append it to a little ID card, which you could show to get into town. And so many people, I know the two of you have seen these before. We call them badge photos, although it was more likely that they were on a little card that would be shown.
Uh,
But these famous photos are out there of many of the scientists. We don't have a comprehensive collection. We probably have maybe a third or a half of the staff we have photographs of. I don't know what happened to the rest of them, but but anyway, you'd get your photo taken. They would give you just instructions for making your trip the rest of the way up the hill. Okay, and so this is where our the next step in trying to get our samples of material up to Los Alamos. So there were various ways. Usually, you could catch an army truck or car. I'm guessing that it probably would have been a military vehicle, especially since our person is in the military, and they probably wanted to take care of the contents that he had on him. And so anyway, you would drive up the hill. And so for those of you again who are not from here, now I mentioned I went to Texas Tech. If you're in West Texas, you may not know what a hill is, and I get that. I was there once, and in some places the topography actually is not flat. It like goes up and down and things like that. Those are what we call hills and even mountains here in Los Alamos. Uh, I remember, we have what we call the Main Hill Road, okay, and this is a road that kind of follows the side of a mesa up here to town. And I believe Los Alamos is like at 7,200 feet. I mean, we're way up there. We're the Denver, the Mile High City. Not particularly impressed here at Los Alamos. Great place though. I'm going there after this interview, coincidentally. But we're way up there at 7,200 feet. And I remember the first time I drove up that hill coming from West Texas, I thought I was going to die. It was 10 miles down into a bottomless pit.
yeah.
I've kind of gotten used to it now, but that's why we're called the hill. I mean, literally, you would drive up this hill. So Santa Fe has pretty high elevation as well. And you leave Santa Fe, you kind of drive down into a valley, and then you drive back up into Los Alamos, and then you get to town. Now, back then, and until 1957, there was a fence that went all the way around town, not just the laboratory, but the entire town had a fence around it. And so everybody coming in pretty much had to have that photo ID that they picked up at 109 East Palace so that the guard could see you and let you in. Now, that just gets you into town. And that alone is a pretty significant accomplishment, having come all the way across country from Tennessee. But we're going to want to go ahead and get that material to a safe place within the confines of the laboratory itself. And really, especially back then, the town and the laboratory were really close. I mean, you would have literally on one side of the road, the main road through town, still being Trinity Drive. We're really creative with our names. There's like 50 things called Trinity around here, but at least it's a good name, right? But on one side of Trinity Drive, you would have like buildings where we're going to take that material, like D building. That's D building was the original site where we worked on kind of high hazard materials, fissile materials. So you'd be working with plutonium, polonium, uranium, things like that. And just a couple hundred yards away across the street, you would have apartments and things like that. So when I say that, the two were integrated together, I think Oppenheimer's commute was like a 200-yard walk from his office to his house in town. And so that's where the material would end up. And so we're making it in the Calutrons out there at Oak Ridge. We're going to come across country and train with our briefcase, probably end up at the Lamy train station, go to 109 East Palace, get a few more directions, make the drive up the hill. And one last thing there. Now, if you were in town and you had your little photo ID card, that doesn't get you into the heart of the laboratory itself. The way that all of that was controlled was with buttons. And so I bet you've seen this famous photo, and probably a lot of viewers for this as well. After the Trinity test, Oppenheimer and his boss, General Groves, went to the Trinity site. I believe that was in mid-September, 1945. So a couple months after Trinity. You'll notice on Oppenheimer's lapel, he's got this round button. It's a white button. And so the full staff members got white buttons. If a guard saw your photo ID and saw that white button, they'd pretty much let you in any place that you wanted. Now, not everybody, a lot of the technicians, other critical people, they didn't have white buttons. They had buttons that were different colors. Some of them had different outlines. That indicated where you could go within the laboratory. That's the way that it was controlled. But anyway, yeah, if you're carrying like enriched uranium, we'll let you go wherever you want. Just take that right on in there, and let's get that stored safely. So kind of a roundabout answer to the question, but hopefully some interesting material. I'm sure Keith can cut out like the 10 minutes that you didn't need or want. So
No, that was fine. That was exactly what I wanted, because we've told the story often here about how it left Oak Ridge, but we just said it went to Los Alamos. Well, there was a lot more to getting into Los Alamos than just driving up in a vehicle or catching a train out there. Well, you mentioned Trinity. Talk just a little bit about what Trinity was and the test that took place out there.
Just a little bit, I have a 2-hour lecture on Trinity, and it's still getting longer. But anyway, I will mention this before I forget. For those who are interested in a little bit more detail about Trinity, I do have an article that's going to be published later this year by the American Nuclear Society. Here at Los Alamos, we have put together essentially a book with the society that's going to be published. Lots of technical articles, and my article will kind of kick the volume off by giving an overview of the story, if you will. And so be on the lookout for that. A lot of new material, and you may want to ask me about our actual repository here, because we have an incredible library that we made use of for this volume. But anyway, going back to Trinity, you're going to produce fissile material. You've got a good bomb design. You start building this stuff. You put it together. Are you ready to put it into combat without a full-scale test? So that is the question. Now, we've got really 3 different types of bombs during World War II that were considered seriously. The first one was called Thin Man. Okay, so Thin Man was a plutonium gun-assembled weapon. So for those of you who don't know out there, gun-assembled nuclear weapon, you take one subcritical mass of fissile material, you shoot it at another subcritical mass of fissile material. And you might be thinking, well, that's like scary simple. Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but it is pretty simple from an engineering standpoint, and that's why we like it. We also like it because it uses plutonium. Plutonium's more efficient to use in a nuclear weapon than enriched uranium. Enriched uranium's really hard to make, and you're going to need a lot of it. And that's why the efforts of Oak Ridge were so heroic, because it takes a lot and it's really hard to do. Remember, the largest building in the world is built just for that purpose. And so the backup plan is Little Boy. Little Boy is the backup plan simply because it uses enriched uranium, and we're going to need more of it. Again, both of these are gun-assembled nuclear weapons. Well, about halfway through the work here at Los Alamos, we figure out that Thin Man's not going to work due to spontaneous fission. So you shoot that subcritical fissile mass at your target, because there's too many neutrons in flux, it's not going to assemble. You want a bomb to come together and explode. What would happen in Thin Man is it would kind of start to come together and just splat. It wouldn't work. And so this was a fizzle. And so we had 18 Nobel laureates at the laboratory during World War II. One of them was Emilio Segre. He's the one who first started doing these experiments. And as we did them into the late spring and summer of 1944, figured out that this just was not going to work as a weapon. this is a big problem because we really need the plutonium to work as well as our enriched uranium device. And so Oppenheimer completely reorganizes the laboratory to build an imploding bomb. So this is a completely different type of bomb architecture. We're going to take a sphere of plutonium instead of projectiles and things like that. We'll take a sphere of plutonium, we're going to surround it by thousands of pounds of high explosives, set off the high explosives, crush the core of plutonium, and boom, we get an explosion. Sounds simple, but this is more complex, and it uses off-the-shelf high explosives in exactly the opposite way that they're intended, right? Explosives are supposed to expand, releasing energy, not implode upon themselves. And so anyway, this was a really hard challenge, and Oppenheimer reorganized the laboratory to do this on August 14th, 1944. Okay. Now, if that date, August 14th, sounds familiar, it's probably because exactly 1 year later, that was the day that the Japanese emperor announced the armistice. And so you think about that 1 year from formal reorg to combat delivery, testing, and of course the end, almost officially the end of the war. And so fortunately, before that, though, back as Segre began figuring out the problems with the with Thin Man, they start looking for a test site to test a new type of bomb because they know they don't have much time. It's going to be more complex than they thought. And as the test director of Trinity, Ken Bainbridge, said, you know, nobody here was content that the first trial of a Fat Man bomb would be over enemy territory, where if the bomb didn't go off, it would just splatter a bunch of plutonium all over the place, which could be recovered by the enemy. So that's the main reason that we're going to do the Trinity test, and it was named Trinity by Oppenheimer, is to make sure that the bomb works. That's the main reason. Now, Little Boy goes into combat. It's the first to go into combat, of course, using enriched uranium from Y-12. It's used against the Japanese city of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. It was not tested at full scale. Sometimes you'll hear people say that Little Boy was not tested before it went into combat. Well, that's kind of true and kind of not. It is true that it was not tested full scale. But I promise you this, there were lots of tests of Little Boy technology right here at Los Alamos. They tested every component of it. And, you know, because of things like criticality testing, they knew it was going to work. I mean, they were all but certain that Little Boy was going to work. The odds of it not working were astronomically small. So they were kind of beyond confident Little Boy would be fine, but just never had that confidence level for the imploding bomb, which was codenamed the Gadget. And of course, the combat device a little bit later becomes known as Fat Man, which we've all heard of before. And so Trinity is the full-scale test of the Fat Man type bomb, codenamed the Gadget. It's performed on July 16th, 1945. To put that in perspective in terms of the war, Hitler shot himself, I believe, on April 30th, 1945. Nazi Germany formally surrendered about a week later. I believe that it was May 7th, and fighting stops in Europe the next day on May 8th. By the way, one of the rehearsal tests for Trinity was done on May 7th, just hours apart from these events. Unfortunately, Imperial Japan decided to keep on fighting, though. We can talk about that more if you would like later. But anyway, Trinity is remarkably successful. This device produces a yield equivalent to 21,000 tons of TNT. That's the official Department of Energy number that we have released. Now, I mentioned the American Nuclear Society volume that we have coming up. There is one chapter in there which has gone back, looked at the radiochemistry, and done a reanalysis of the yield of Trinity. And according to that reanalysis, at least, it has boosted the yield up a little bit. But you know, numbers aside, that's a really big explosion. And you know, this is it's revolutionary because you can put thousands and thousands of tons of TNT equivalent now into one bomb and put that into one plane, and you can just take out a city. There's no countermeasure for that, and I think that's really the one thing that makes nuclear weapons so remarkable, is that up to this point in time there were countermeasures for 1,000 plane bombing raids. Might not have worked very well late in the war for Germany or Japan, but for a nuclear weapon there's nothing you can do to fight back. And of course Trinity was the proof test of that, and in and of itself is a fascinating story with lots of aspects, but I will spare you those details unless you want to follow up on something. I love talking Trinity.
I knew you did, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to do it for just a little bit. But I have seen your presentation on Trinity, and and it is very well done. And I'm looking forward to that article. You mentioned it's going to be a book. Will a book be available to the public?
Yes, and I think that will be the final version of what we're doing with the American Nuclear Society. I think it'll come out late this year. Hopefully, I'm casting it the right way. I'm not sure if it's going to be like the journal article or
Yeah.
journal for that part of the year. It's going to be a really thick journal because I think that there's going to be between 25 and 40 articles in there just from Los
Wow.
Alamos current staff members. So it
Yeah.
is a tremendous amount of new, for the most part, technical scholarship pertaining to Trinity. And some of the articles on there pertain to there's my overview, but then you have articles on the 100-ton test. That was the rehearsal test that was done. Jumbo was the containment vessel. One aspect we
Yeah.
didn't talk about with Trinity is when they were really certain or uncertain that it would work. They thought, well, if we test it in the open air, it's going to splatter plutonium all over the place. How do we get it back, recast it, and start over again? Well, they thought, well, what if we blew it up in a containment vessel instead? And
Yeah.
so Jumbo was that containment vessel. Wasn't used in the test. It is still at the test site. But articles on that, articles on plutonium metal preparation, just things that are all over the place, and by some of the world's best scientists, here at the lab. So do be on the lookout from that American Nuclear Society later this year.
Yeah, I will. And oh, by the way, I have a photograph of me standing inside Jumbo. So, they blew it up later, and it
Yes.
actually just blew the ends off of it. So it's standing out there now, or laying out there in the sand as a cylinder. So I just stepped up inside it, and I had my picture made standing inside Jumbo. I'll have to tell you, that was a tremendous opportunity I had to visit there. I was able to arrange for a private visit, just me, 4 hours at Trinity, with just me and the public relations persons from the White Sands Missile Range. I thoroughly enjoyed that.
I've had the same opportunity, and I want to commend the people at White Sands for a variety of reasons. I mean, first of all, they've done a very nice job keeping up the site. Another thing is that we get VIP access. We're the historians with the government. We get to go in. Same experience here, and I appreciate those. They can't do that for everybody in the public, though, but they accommodate thousands of people twice a year typically. And I was talking with my good friend Jim Eccles, who was with public affairs for many years, took me on my 4 hour half a day experience there. Jim has a book called Trinity, by the way. It's available on Amazon, highly recommended there too. But Jim, when you talk to him, I asked him, and I put this in my paper, I said, what is the meaning of the Trinity site to you? And he said, well, and I'm paraphrasing, you can see this in my article. He said, well, Trinity site to me, in part, is just making sure that we have enough porta potties for 3,000 people, that we've got crowd control ready, because he's done that tour so many times. But they really are first class. They did a very nice commemoration ceremony this past summer. This past summer, of course, was the 75th anniversary of Trinity and the atomic bombings in Japan. They did a really nice ceremony down there. They made it available live stream. I think that you can still see it online. So really, at White Sands, back then known as the Alamogordo Bombing Range, just wonderful folks.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's really good. Keith, you have anything else you'd like for
we could
Rylan to look into?
we could spend the next 3 or 4 hours talking. I'm sure we could, but no,
we might yeah, I was going to say, we might, Alan, arrange for you to have another visit with us before too long. So
I would love that.
I think we could go longer than we've gone today. And in fact, I would suggest that there's a whole additional history of both Oak Ridge and Los Alamos after the Manhattan Project. And even today, it's continued to make history routinely and regularly. So let's just make a commitment that we will have a follow-up session on this. And I don't know if 2 weeks from now is too soon, you say so, but if not, Keith, we might just schedule him for 2 weeks from today. What do you think?
whenever he's free to come back, we can do that. So
I'd love to do it, and I appreciate you both. And that's one thing. The Los Alamos, or I should say, the Manhattan Project, has paid my bills for a long time. But there's like another 70, 80 years of history here, and so many incredible stories to tell. And as Ray, as you mentioned at Y12, and as both of you know, Y12 is still making history today, and that's certainly the case here at Los Alamos as well. We've got scientists who have been battling COVID. We have scientists who are exploring Mars right now. I mean, there's and of course we still play a vital role in the stockpiled stewardship program, ensuring the safety and reliability of the arsenal, the nuclear arsenal today. So there's a lot more to tell. I love visiting with you guys today. I look forward to coming back before long. And yeah, thank you.
all right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much. And Ray, we'll be back in a couple more weeks, and
Right.
we'll let the folks know who we're going to have on the next time.
Well, if Alan can be with us, it'll be him. If not, we'll schedule someone else.
All right. Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Alan. And folks, thanks for watching. We certainly do appreciate it. We'll see you again in a couple of weeks.